Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. This event is part 2 of the Countering Islamophobia Through Education, a 2-part series. I'm Amra Shabi-Reyes, a faculty member at Columbia University's Graduate School of Education, Health and Psychology. I'm deeply grateful to Columbia Global Centers in Amman, Istanbul, and Tunis for partnering with me on this effort to magnify the important voices of my incredible students and activists who come from all over the world, but who speak in unison against Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, as well as other forms of exclusion and discrimination many individuals and communities continue to experience in the world today. My students' interests in countering Islamophobia have emerged during our work in a course on Islam, education, and radicalization that I teach at Columbia. This particular course is my effort to catalyze change and examine the true causes of radicalization amongst youths in hope of preventing it. My scholarly work centers on changing the broader paradigms or the ways we think about the role of education in social disintegration, Islamophobia, exclusion, corruption, favoritism, and radicalization. The Islamophobic narrative that has frequently depicted a global community of nearly 2 billion Muslims as violent and monolithic should be of a concern to all of us. Othering Muslims through Islamophobic narratives undermines social cohesion in our increasingly diverse societies. Therefore, broadening representation and inclusion of Muslims and their voices in both the Western and non-Western contexts, and particularly in schools, is a prerequisite for social cohesion in our presently polarizing societies. Today, you will hear 2 presentations, followed by reflections and questions from our discussants. Our first discussant is Dr. Renee Hattar. She's the head of international studies at the Royal Institute for Interfaith Studies and was previously professor of Arabic language and culture at the International Center for the Study of the Christian Orient. Dr. Hattar was awarded a PhD in social sciences at the University of Granada. Our second discussant is Dr. Firat Kurt, who is a political anthropologist working on the entanglements of political mobilization, economic infrastructures, and religious pragmatics. He's a postdoctoral research scholar in the Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies at Columbia University. He has a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. Thank you, Renee and Firat, for being with us today. Our first presentation, titled Countering Islamophobia, a Parental Peace Education Approach, will be delivered by Raksha Sule, Lauren Gonzalez, Yuji Yang, and Rachel Karnoff. They argued that current attempts to combat Islamophobia and biases in the United States focus on students, but that the critical role of parents is often overlooked and notably absent from anti-Islamophobia education initiatives. Their presentation conceptualizes a peace education curriculum model to address Islamophobia amongst parents and caregivers in the United States. The second presentation, titled Incorporating Islam into the Mainstream Education System, a Strategy to Counter Islamophobia, will be delivered by Ayelet Hillel, Maximilian Rojas Domke, and Tiansung Zhu. They find that the key factor leading to Islamophobic views is misinformed narratives around Islam and Muslims that are often promoted in the popular media. Max, Tiansung, and Ayelet argue that the education system is vital in deconstructing negative perceptions of Islam among non-Muslims and in reconstructing inclusive narratives. Their analysis shows that by incorporating the study of Islam as part of the mainstream curriculum, the education system can raise the base level of understanding regarding Muslim culture and faith in the general population to create mutual tolerance and understanding. As we begin our program for today, I ask that you please submit your questions throughout our session today. You can use the Q&A button on the Zoom dashboard to submit your question. And without further ado, I invite Raksha, Lauren, Yuji, and Rachel to begin our program. First, they will share a positionality statement on behalf of both groups, followed by their presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Before we move into our presentations, we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement and a positionality statement. Even though much of our learning and work is in the virtual space today, we are privileged and grateful to be students of Columbia University, and thus we would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Lenape people on which we learn and work at Columbia University. Lenape means real person or original person, and it is important to remember that Lenape collectively are a living and breathing community. We honor their legacy and continue to commit to learning and educating ourselves about the European colonizing forces that have dispossessed Lenape and other indigenous people of their lands in both local and global contexts. Currently, present in cultural, political, ideological, educational, and economic forms, neocolonial forces continue to impact and shape many communities around the world. We invite you to honor the Lenape people with us, and as we meet today on a virtual platform, we invite you to also take a moment to acknowledge the lands and peoples of those lands from wherever you may be situated today. We are committed to working towards social justice by unearthing and improving inequities of all marginalized people to the best of our ability. This is also the purpose of why we are meeting today, to acknowledge and consider how to transform the deep-rooted injustice of Islamophobia. Our classroom environment, cultivated by Professor Amra Sabic El-Rais, was characterized by open communication, sincere reflection, the sharing of personal experiences, and the free exchange of ideas. Out of this enriching experience emerged this positionality statement, which we, as a class, wish to read to introduce the lecture series on preventing Islamophobia through education. As a group of students at Teachers College, Columbia University, we would like to, following from our land acknowledgement, give attention to the following. First, although we are presenting under the theme of Islamophobia, we do not claim, nor do we wish to leave an impression, that we identify with the Islamophobia experienced by the students and citizens in our presentations. We wish to spotlight the sensitivity of this topic area and hope to meet it with intellectual humility and courage. As students of Columbia University, we believe firmly that it is vital to take note of the privileged platform from which we are speaking and recognize that this privilege is rightly tethered to both the responsibility to our intellectual questions and to the accountability to those who suffer from Islamophobia in the US, and considering this as Columbia Global Centers, the world. Further, as students of Columbia University's Graduate School of Education, Teachers College, we want to draw attention to the value of the field of education as fertile ground for addressing Islamophobia and encourage researchers in the field of education to continue raising their voices on these issues. We look forward to presenting to you all today, and thank you for joining us. We will now start our first presentation with Yuji.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here. The topic of our group is Countering Islamophobia, a parental peace education approach. We will start by introducing the background and the rationale, and then we will discuss the methodology. In the end, we will give recommendations on curriculum model. First, the background. Islamophobia is traditionally been defined as the both prejudice and hostility towards Muslims. It distorted and simplified Islam and Muslim world. People who believe in Islamophobia always shows an irrational hatred and alarmism of the faith and followers of Islam. Regardless of the US Constitution's prohibits in 2010, 28% of the voters do not believe Muslims should be eligible to sit on the US Supreme Court, and nearly 1/3 of the country thinks the adherents of Islam should be barred from running for president. Then what caused this overfear? The root, I think, can be found in three aspects. First, educational curricula. In analysis on the contents of 36 social science textbooks for primary and middle schools in California and other states during 1974 to 1975, Islam was portrayed as violence lovers who permit slavery and sexism in the textbook. Also, Arabs was described as people who are passionate about robbery. Second, politics. Islamophobia has been used as a political tool. It has been effectively for current administration to take power of using the marginalization of Muslims. The government took advantage of the anti-Muslim sentiment after the 9/11 terror attacks to justify the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Third, media. Take the explosion in Oklahoma City as an example. All the most influential television channels in the US called for the necessity of declaring a holy war against Middle Eastern terrorism. As a result, more than 200 recorded violent activities were conducted against Muslim Americans in the following 3 days. In a survey conducted earlier this year showed that 50% of Americans consider Muslims as anti-Western, same as the results conducted in the next year.
As UG presented, the widespread Islamophobia in the United States necessitates an educational plan of action. However, current attempts to combat Islamophobia and biases in the US focus exclusively on students. The critical role of parents is often overlooked and notably absent from anti-Islamophobia education initiatives. Thus, this presentation aims to conceptualize an adult peace education curriculum model to address Islamophobia amongst parents and caregivers in the United States. The important role of parents in the creation of a child's psychology is grounded in theory. Bronfenbrenner's ecological model of a child development identifies the different layers that define key developmental contexts. This presentation focuses on layer 1, the microsystem, describing the interactions between the individual child and the immediate setting, such as the school or home environment where primary relationships are established. The relationship between parents and their children exist in this layer and represent the closest relationship a child has when forming their opinions, attitudes, biases about the world around them. The other 3 layers represent a child's interaction with existing societal structures and the larger cultural context. The mesosystem concerns the interaction between the child's family and school settings, or alternatively, among the family system and the child's extended social network. The exosystem is an extension of the mesosystem and includes both formal and informal societal structures. The macrosystem encompasses the larger cultural context, including beliefs, customs, and the historical and political aspects that may affect a child's life. In Allport's The Nature of Prejudice, the primacy of a parent's effect on a child is examined. Allport asserts that children acquire their racial attitudes from their parents through processes of socialization. While this theory has evolved since then to incorporate other elements that impact a child, such as in Bronfenbrenner's layers, the identification of the crucial role of the parent remains to this day. It is necessary to define peace education here. In short, peace education refers to the process of promoting the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values necessary to prevent conflict and violence, both overt and structural, and to resolve conflict peacefully. We believe peace education can play a pivotal role in combating Islamophobia in the United States. This can be done through 3 steps inherent in the peace education ethos. First, multiculturalism. By highlighting the existing divisions such as race, religion, ethnicity, etc. in the United States and in people's immediate surroundings, people can begin to acknowledge and question the biases they may have and the biases of others. Second, conflict resolution. Peace education involves participatory pedagogical practices that allows participants to build skills in critical thinking, in empathy, and cooperation. This facilitates the ability to not only acknowledge, but to learn how to discuss and empathize with another's worldview. Third, tolerance. Peace education encourages tolerance by encouraging people to accept alternative viewpoints and live among the differences of others. Ideally, people can grow to become tolerant and thus prevent Islamophobia from permeating into mainstream US society.
Thank you, Rachel. Moving into our methodology now, with the goal to develop a parental peace education curriculum to counter Islamophobia, we leveraged 3 approaches. First, we held informal interviews with our parents to understand and acknowledge that our families do not have associations to Islam. Our families exist across a spectrum of holding prejudices, and thus it would be parents like ours who could attend and benefit from such a program. The informal interviews also served as a foundation to moving into our literature review and taking a case study approach to finding best practices of peace education models and curricula aimed at addressing Islamophobia. Moving into the results of the interviews. First, parents described their opinion of Islamophobia as inevitable, needing more attention, and as a form of bigotry, signifying that Islamophobia is a recognizable concern that should be addressed. Second, parents described that they receive information about Islam largely from the media, which is often negative, and also, though to a lesser extent, from books and articles and stories of hardship from their clients and colleagues who subscribe to Islam. As well, when asked whether parents should receive education in schools targeted at combating Islamophobia, it was noted that this, first, might be impossible, particularly for parents who work and are away from school. Second, it would have to be based on parents' interests, which could range dramatically. And third, it was shared that rather than focusing on just Islamophobia, there should be teachings that address all forms of prejudice against all races, religions, and cultures. Finally, when asked what an educational model for parents could include, a diverse range of answers were provided. This included increasing people's awareness about facts related to terrorism and religious groups, understanding blatant discrimination and microaggressions, developing critical thinking skills, addressing fears, ensuring that the delivery method was continuous, and even perhaps leaning into the media and pop culture for positive portrayals of Islam. Now, one consideration with these formal interviews is that the sample size is 4, which means while these are critical insights, the results cannot be generalized across communities and populations. Thus, further exploratory investigations with parents and caregivers in the community for program implementation would need to be done in order to best contextualize the curriculum model. Regardless, using these insights and leaning on the literature review and case studies that we found, we mapped a potential curriculum model for a parental peace education approach that could address Islamophobia. Beginning first with content, we suggest framing the content around the themes of tolerance, humility, connection, empathy, and unity. Based on our findings, these themes can address interpersonal and intergroup interactions, but importantly, also create a safe space to address underlying causes and systemic considerations that lead to Islamophobia. These themes can also help shape the types of knowledges, skills, and attitudes and values that should flourish. We leave these competencies as vague for now because of this last significant component of co-creation. Here, we believe in collaborating with the community, which includes parents and youth who have faced Islamophobia, non-Islamic parents and youth, and school and community leaders to co-design and deliver the curriculum. In this way, the curriculum is contextualized to the needs of the community and would be most responsive and meaningful to the transformational change that needs to occur. Moving into the methodologies and approaches, we suggest leveraging best practices found in peace education models, such as the psychocognitive understandings of transformative learning, grounding the delivery process within a rights-based approach, and utilizing participatory and empowerment-based facilitative methods, such as real-time case studies, narrative sharing, open space discussions and dialogues, and community engagement activities. Together, these can promote critical thinking, deep reflection and reflexivity, and the capacity for an individual to transform and evolve biases and assumptions.
Thank you so much, Raksha. Moving on, so effective implementation of this curriculum can be achieved through community-oriented delivery. It must be acknowledged that a majority of sensitivity, tolerance, or anti-bias training which adults receive are through work or employment. Thus, the interests of the employer or the community are at the forefront. A community-oriented approach eliminates some of that biases and helps to ensure that the needs and interests of the community are at the forefront. Ways in which this content can be more localized and accessible can be through non-formal education. By default, most adults do not participate nor are involved in formal education, so non-formal would be the best approach. Next, this content can be delivered in school settings through parent participation, being required to volunteer or participate in school-based activities for their kids, or incentive for child's private school admittance. Also, this curriculum can be delivered through parent-teacher conferences, as well as handouts that would go home with the students. Lastly, we acknowledge that parents might not be able to participate in their child's education or school life and in their activities, so religious and ethnic centers could be a good opportunity for that. And local religious or ethnic leaders in churches or community centers can offer the curriculum to their members. We also must acknowledge the challenges in the delivery. So while Islamophobia deserves direct attention and intervention, there is a lot of rejection and skepticism due to current existing biases. For example, there was a lot of criticism against the City of Philadelphia school systems for relying on the Council of Islamic Relations for their teacher sensitivity training, which relied heavily on and directly focused on combating Islamophobia. This was largely due to mistrust and the belief that the curriculum and content excluded other marginalized groups. Next, across the country, there's extreme differences towards and attitudes towards Muslims and Islamophobia. So areas which are more diverse will be more likely to accept this curriculum, where the individuals who need it most will be more likely to reject. Lastly, parents and guardians may not have the time to dedicate to such a program, so curriculum should be and could be condensed and disseminated in brief yet frequently revisited mediums to facilitate a continuous discussion. To ensure the sustainability and scalability of this program, we have the following overarching recommendations. First, contextualization to specific demographic and populations to ensure it's meeting the needs of the community. Next, policy requirements and mandates for peace education content to be delivered continuously and frequently. Next, co-creation of content development should involve relevant local and stakeholders, should involve relevant and local stakeholders. And lastly, capacity to ensure that the necessary human, financial, and technical support is available to be carried out. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much, and we open the floor to any questions.
Thank you so much, Yuji, Rachel, Lauren, and Raksha for your insightful presentation. I'll encourage for anyone who has questions for you to use Q&A button on the Zoom dashboard and send that question my way as I moderate the rest of the session for today. But now I would like to invite Ayelet, Max, and Tian-Xung to start with their presentation at this time.
Well, hello there. So my name is Maximilian Rojas Dompe. I am one of 3 people about to be presenting to you, and I'd like to introduce my 2 co-presenters. Either one of you, whichever one. Tian, would you like to say hello?
Tian, I think you're muted.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Tian-Xung Zhu, and I'm currently a second-year graduate student in Teachers College, Columbia University, majoring in economics and education.
And my name is Ayelet Hillel, and I'm a second-year master's student in economics and education.
So this is incorporating Islam into the mainstream education system, a strategy to counter Islamophobia. So really quick, before we start, I'd like to walk you through what our presentation will entail. So initially, we're going to be talking about how Islamophobia concerns in public schools, where they're going to talk about teachers in conservative districts confronting Islamophobia, then teaching faith in a secular setting in a case study, applying what we've learned towards future healing, the 4 phases of incorporating Islam into the mainstream education, and a Q&A. Before we get into the first bullet, I just want to kind of reaffirm what our beliefs are and our positionality within this presentation. So we do believe that a key factor leading to Islamophobic views are misinformed narratives around Islam and Muslims that are often promoted in the popular media. The education system is vital in deconstructing negative perceptions of Islam among non-Muslims and reconstructing inclusive narratives. By incorporating the study of Islam as part of the mainstream curriculum, the education system can raise the base level of understanding regarding Muslim culture and faith in the general population to create a mutual tolerance and understanding. So now I'd like to hand it off to Tian.
Hello, everyone. So I will start with Islamophobia concerns in public schools. And there are 4 common concerns of a public school teacher when they educating Muslim students by parents. And these results are from Professor Niazov and Pulim's research. And I will introduce the first concern. The first concern is that teachers may show fear or prejudice against the Muslim students, which may harm Muslim students' confidence of their personality. And some study results from Muslim parents bolster this worry. For example, a Pakistani Muslim parent in the UK reported that his kid was attacked by peers in school, but her teacher neglected her anxiety. However, since there are no cross-referring information with instructors and the delicate deconstructions with students support these outcomes, these models might just be sort of an even negative generalizing of teachers in public schools. In fact, many teachers in public schools and regional education organizations are making efforts to against Islamophobia. For example, the York Region District's School Board in Toronto collaborated with local Muslim educators to build an online resource center to provide academic and professional resources and anti-Islamophobia assistance to teachers and students. And the second concern is that teachers with a Christian background may ignore or denigrate historic and contemporary contributions of Muslims in science, geography, literature, etc. However, there are a growing number of teachers in public schools enthusiastically incorporate positive perspectives of their students' religious background. For example, an American primary school teacher, her name is Stark, encouraged Muslim students to tell his stories to their parents and peers and makes them realize that it's so lucky that he can speak 2 languages by using English and Arabic with them together in the classroom. So next slide, please. The third concern is that public school teachers have low expectations for Muslim students, channel them into general or lower streams or into ESL classes, which ultimately hindering the students' current achievement and future aspirations. In fact, teachers defend their Muslim students' hopes and aspirations, enabling their students to succeed. Many non-Muslim teachers, conscious of sensitives surrounding Islam and Muslims, make extra efforts to celebrate Muslim festivals, traditions, achievement, and help their students with legal or other problems they face in their school and community. Also, a Muslim teacher in Canada points out that Muslim students are not only students who attend ESL classes. Children may only have social contact within their Muslim communities, which makes their English level is weaker than their peers. So she suggests that the ESL classes enrollment needs an accountability check to ensure all of these students can rapidly progress and moving out of ESL classes. And the last concern is that Western teachers are often accused for insensitivity in accommodating Muslims' religious practice. However, a survey from public school teachers in perception of religion in Birmingham, UK shows a different aspect. There are about 94% of public school educators agree that all religions should be respected for their intrinsic values, and about 82% disagreed with the statement that pupils' religion and culture ought to be left at home. So now let's see a case study about how teachers confronting Islamophobia in a rural West Virginia classroom. The theoretical basis for this research is that intergroup relations improved when the in-group students, which means local person, perceives the out-group, which is the newcomers, as valuable equals. And the researchers designed a class series to help students overcome Islamophobia by inviting Muslim immigrants or students to introduce their countries and their Muslim culture. So in the first class, the teacher played a video to show 2 Iraq girls flee from their hometown to a refugee camp during the war and broach a classroom discussion. And in the rest of the 3 classes, the teacher invited 3 role models from different Muslim countries to show their life experiences or share some videos about Muslim countries and give students a chance to communicate with these presenters. The aim for these classes to emphasize that differences are a resource for understanding, dialogue, and debate. Participating students lived in West Virginia town with total population of 934, and 99 of these residents are white working classes. The median household income is roughly half the national average. Also, this community is very conservative. The teacher also designed an agree and disagree survey asking students following question: Muslim cause all terrorism, and no Muslim should live in the United States. The teacher measures the proportion of agree and disagree before and after class series. So next slide, please. So let me introduce the findings and results. And as we can see from the survey results, much of the pre-study prejudice from Muslim was gone. From the case study result, we can see that after intervention, the students who have negative comments, attitudes, and word choices regarding to the Middle East and the Muslim was decreased vastly. For example, from the result, we can see that after this set of courses helping students know more about the Muslim world, no one agreed that there's a relationship between Muslim and terrorism. But before that study, more than 1/3 of students agree with this viewpoint. So this case study results support the idea that improved intergroup relations are dependent on individuals' positive perceptions of the outgroup. And from this research, we can see that students and teachers must concern themselves with providing positive and anxiety-free contact in the intercultural contact process and help students to build positive interaction experiences.
Thank you so much, Dion. And now I will present my portion, which is teaching faith in a secular setting. It's just another case study. So I would like to preface this. Before explaining this fascinating case study, it behooves me to give background on it and why we feel it ties into our desired goal, which is incorporating the study of Islam into more mainstream education. Through this case study and our presentation, we continue to hope to illustrate to you the proven feasibility of combining religious studies in secular schools. Like you will see, this fusion leads to greater academic competency, more holistic discussion and thoughts, as well as an increase in shared empathy and camaraderie between students of different backgrounds and faiths. In essence, and in this case study, tenets of Christian faith were entwined in the learning to both Catholics and Protestants. These denominations understand their texts differently, yet showed constructive growth regarding patience and cooperation within faiths. From this, we believe that Islam education to both Muslim, Sunni, and Shia, and non-Muslim individuals will have the same effect of greater understanding and community. So, theoretical framework. The goal here is to consider outcomes and roles regarding religious literacy with regards to the diverse culture and linguistic abilities of the children in the classroom. Some methods. This took place in a 9th grade reading class at an unidentified high school with a diverse student population. The school is based in a large metropolitan area in the southwestern United States. Participants totaled about 17. This includes the teacher, 13 students from a shared main class, and 3 other students. The participants' ages range from 14 to 16 years old. The students are primarily Hispanics from Mexico or Mexican-American backgrounds. Additionally, there were African-American students, and the teacher was a white woman in her middle age. From a faith standpoint, the students were a mixture of Catholic and Protestant. Their connections and understandings of their faiths varied in intensity and complexity. The teacher did not disclose her own faith. Alison Scrett, the author of this piece, identified herself as Protestant for the sake of authenticity. A little bit of data analysis really quick. Then consisted of collecting notes based on classroom and out-of-school observation, which were then contrasted with interview transcripts and documents. These were then combed through to find parts relating to student religious literacy, which constitutes the foundation for the research. So, this case study offers, through these findings, we find some questions. Question 1, how did a literacy teacher engage her students' Christian religious literacies in schools? Because the teacher centered her learning structures around multiliteracies, essentially incorporating in student cultures and linguistic backgrounds to the pedagogy, she was then able to utilize their religious literacies for secular understanding of concepts. Basically, she used what they already knew through their culture, combined it with understanding of the lessons and tenets established in their faith, to provide avenues of understanding and growth within the classroom. Question 2, How did students, in response to their teachers' invitations and through their own agency, engage their religious literacies in the classroom? Through teacher guidance and support, students were able to synthesize their religious teachings to better understand secular topics and concepts, as well as an improved writing ability. And then question 3, what were the outcomes of the teacher and the students' transactions with religious literacies in schools? Unsurprisingly, as religious literacy was introduced, tensions between faith and perceptions of it did rise. The students and teachers navigated this through shared human empathy, as well as a commitment to the community and a desire to understand one another. This was done through highlighting the similarities that were shared between faiths and individuals and how those similarities actualized. So, here I have provided you a transcript a teacher had with one of her students for your ease and reference. I also have additional background information I would like to share. This example provided is where one of the girls in the class, Nina, talks to her teacher, Miss Campbell, about how to deal with life's tragedies. While Miss Campbell does not share Nina's faith, something they both knew, the teacher validates Nina's beliefs while reiterating her own. Miss Campbell then tries to introduce brevity to this exchange while validating that the two share the goal of understanding the world, even though they have different faiths. Nina then acknowledged this effort and was neither upset nor diminished by the exchange. This normal conversation is something many adults struggle to do. Nina seeing this complex discussion as happenstance shows how positive her perception is regarding different faiths from her own, as a disagreement was simply something that happens in her worldview. So what are the implications of this? Let's talk about the findings. There are 3 main ones: teacher proficiency, classroom environment, and future implications. So teacher proficiency. The first implication is a welcome, if not surprising one. As teachers incorporate the roles of religious texts from an educational perspective, their tools for connecting and conveying meaningful information to students exponentially grows. Plainly put, this is an additional tool teachers can have to engage with their students. Classroom environment. By giving space for students' faith in the classroom, teachers give students an onus in the classroom. They become more engaged and invest in the learning process as it fosters an environment of openness, respect, and intellectual curiosity. This, of course, carries outside the classroom and into circles students travel within. Lastly, future implications. As teachers introspectively reflect on the crossroads between secular education and religious education, we see deeper understandings emerge. This is a positively cyclical effect where greater empathy and understanding leads to renewed efforts to improve pedagogy, thus furthering introspection and continuing this cycle of mutual care. Now let me hand it off to Ayelet.
Thank you, Max, for your lovely presentation and for highlighting the benefits of incorporating religious literacy into the curriculum. That leads us to the next part of our presentation, which discusses the 4 phases that should be taken in order to effectively incorporate Islam into the mainstream education system. The first phase includes acknowledging Islamophobia, the extent to which it exists within our society and its consequences on Muslims. That includes acknowledging insults, threats, acts of verbal or physical violence toward Muslims, as well as discrimination against Muslims in the labor force and in the schooling system. Importantly, Islamophobia should be referred to as a form of racism and as part of a wider crisis of institutional racism in the Western world. The second component includes identifying and exploring common Islamophobic narratives in the current political climate. The next step includes reflecting on curriculum biases and critically examining whether and how the mainstream curriculum may promote these Islamophobic narratives. The final phase of countering Islamophobia through the mainstream education system includes the promoting of alternative, positive, and inclusive narratives around Islam. As I will discuss in more detail in the next slides, we believe it should be done through integrating the teaching of Islam as a civilization in the mainstream curriculum and highlighting Muslim contribution to society in different fields. Next slide, please. Based on our literature review, we believe that common Islamophobic narratives can be divided into 3 groups. The first Islamophobic myth we identified, threat to security, includes the notion that Muslims are inherently violent and prone to radicalization, and that Islam promotes extremism. This narrative has been increasingly promoted in the public debate since 9/11. The second common Islamophobic narratives we identified is that Muslims are illiberal. That includes the notion that Islam legitimizes extreme forms of gender oppression and homophobic attitudes. Muslim women, a particular vulnerable population, are perceived as victims of alleged oppression within their communities. At the same time, Muslim women also disproportionately experience Islamophobia compared to Muslim men. Therefore, our analysis highlights that when discussing Islamophobic narratives, it is also important to acknowledge that certain groups within Muslim communities may be more vulnerable than others. Lastly, the third narrative we identified, cannot be assimilated, includes the belief that Muslims are unable or unwilling to integrate in Western societies due to their distinguished non-Western values and practices. They are therefore perceived as a threat to national identity and are considered incomplete citizens. The screenshots you can see here are examples of how Islamophobic narratives are supported in the political discourse. The bottom screenshot captures Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, in an election day message. Given that the vast majority of Arabs in Israel are Muslims, this message is an example of promoting the othering of Muslim communities. The second screenshot presents one of many Islamophobic comments made by President Trump that again promotes the narrative of Muslim as a threat and as the other. Next slide, please. Exploring an example of how Islamophobic narratives can be supported in the political discourse leads us to the next question, which is how Islamophobic narratives may be supported in educational spaces and in the mainstream curriculum. Here are a few examples of how biased narratives can be supported in the classroom. One example is not differentiating between radical and non-radical in Islam when discussing terror attacks. Another example is portraying Muslim women as oppressed and submissive in gender classes. And finally, another example is constructing Muslims as the historic enemy in history teaching. After we challenge and deconstruct biased narrative in the mainstream curriculum, we will then construct alternative narratives around Islam. Next slide, please. The first counter-narrative that was found to be effective in several contexts is the tolerance framework, which emphasizes peaceful aspects of Islam as a culture and religious, such as Muslim philosophy, art, and music. The second counter-narrative, compatibility of Islam, highlights the intimate connection between national histories and Islamic cultures over centuries, and the contribution of Islam to Western citizenship in a variety of fields, such as science and literature. The third counter-narrative discusses Muslim women and feminism and includes a promotion of knowledge of Muslim feminists and highlights perspective of Muslim women around gender and Islam. While gender oppression may be present in Muslim communities, it is important to point out that patriarchal structures are not unique to Islam, but are rather a global phenomenon. All three narratives should be designed and implemented in a way that fosters dialogue among young learners and prepare them to become critical consumers of messages promoted in social media and in the news. And that concludes our presentation. We are very thankful and happy to hear any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ayelet, and both groups. Now that we've heard these two incredible, insightful presentations, I would like to invite first Renee and then Firat to share their reflections and pose questions to both groups. And after their questions, we will begin to address some of the amazing questions that you have sent our way. And again, if you haven't asked your question as of yet, please use the Q&A button on the Zoom dashboard to submit your question. So Renee, please.
Thank you, Amra. And congratulations to all these beautiful students on the great work and the very well-researched presentations and projects. So the first presentation regarding the role of parents, and at the Royal Institute, we have been working with designing curricula for training workshops for both teachers and students, but mainly to train teachers on values of human rights, pluralism, tolerance, all these values you mentioned. And the role of parents is one of the most important topics that are usually neglected. So first of all, congratulations on the topic. It's very, very important and timely. Now, what you suggested on how to include that in the curriculum and the non-formal education, I think you nailed it there. The non-formal education is what actually works. That is our experience in fieldwork with students, with teachers, with parents, with everyone, because that is when they are more relaxed. They have a safe space to dialogue, to reflect, to share rather than their very limited time, let's say, during the day or in their jobs, etc. Now, for the second presentation, which was very rich, and I think 2 case studies in such short time are too much for me to comment on. And also very well done on keeping the time limit, which is a bit unfortunate, frankly. There's a lot to reflect on. And I think some of the topics that you brought in the second presentation are very, very important. So, for instance, the separation between politics and religion. Why do we always view Muslims from a political lens, or always connect them to these political, let's say, statements that you indicated through the media or through all the causes you mentioned in your presentation, right? And in the discourses, etc. So the fact that teachers may display phobia because of their I don't know how to call it, ignorance or misinformation, or raising awareness of teachers has been among our concerns as well, even in Muslim countries. Because in the United States, the ignorance may be towards Muslims or other groups, but in countries where the majority are Muslims, we have ignorance towards other non-Muslim groups. So it's let's say global, it's human, it's natural not to know about the other group if it's minor in their numbers, let's just say. So the concern that everybody has been raising is, shall we work on countering Islamophobia, or shall we work together to include everyone, to work on tolerance towards everyone who is different from us? Shall we work on tolerance, inclusiveness? Shall we work towards shared human values, all under the umbrella of human rights, citizenship? Because you mentioned in one of the presentations that the Constitution of the United States does not allow for Islamophobia or other kinds of discriminations. Now, when it comes to applying the Constitution or to what individuals see this socially, that's the story. So do we walk the talk? That's the problem always in societies. So one thing are the regulations, another thing is how they are applied by individuals, I mean. And the big challenge for governments is that you cannot be like a policeman for every citizen. So that is why raising awareness is the most important one. And you talked about empathy, which is very, very important. Unless I know the different other and empathize with him or her as my equal citizen or human being, and nobody can teach us that. Unless we do it because we are convinced, there's no way we can change the situation. Now, before asking you the 2 questions for each group, I wanted you to also reflect on, because I don't know the context of the United States in detail, but do other minorities, whether religious or ethnic minorities, receive the same treatment like Islam or like Muslims? Is Islamophobia compared to these other groups? So this might be my first question to the first group. Because comparing with what the others are receiving, we can see how we can do the balance and how to incorporate all these values you spoke of to also encounter Islamophobia. And this way, the ultimate goal would be human solidarity, let's just say. For the second group, how can we separate politics from religion? How can all these generalizations, let's just say, that usually identify all Muslims as one unit, as one group, Sunni, Shia, you know, we have so many groups, just like in Christianity. You don't just have Catholics, Orthodox, or Protestants. Within each group, you have different rights, you have different groups. So that's another problem. When you raise awareness about Islam, you also need to talk about a culture that has been there for hundreds of years, what goes around this culture, and the other groups who live with Muslims in Muslim countries like For instance, in Jordan, you have Arab Christians, you have Baha'is, you have Druze, you have different groups, right? And how does their experience come into this experience? So the comparison between all these groups works beautifully. So my question is, how can we separate politics from religion in the United States when it comes to encountering Islamophobia? How would you incorporate this? And the last comment I wanted to give is also working in these projects, because that has been our experience, working with religious leaders is very, very important. And working on the spiritual part of religion is very important. And that is where we find the shared points, as humans, I mean, in all religions. We're not talking about hierarchy, we're not talking about differences, we're not talking about politics, we're not talking about regulations, we're talking about spiritual values, how we connect to the creator or to the powers above, depending on each one's religion. And role models. How can we introduce role models? For instance, if the stereotype about Muslims is that all Muslim women are oppressed and they cannot participate as men because it's a hierarchical or I don't know how to call it, a parental system. What about the Muslim women who are models in the Muslim world? Educators, philosophers, architects, doctors. So presenting these role models in the educational system is a beautiful idea to give people another perspective and tell them this actually exists. We're not just inventing this. So the actual experience. And of course, how to enhance dialogue platforms where people can know, speak to each other, get to know the other. And maybe I think the last thing when it comes to civil work or in working in society is how to also cooperate with faith-based NGOs or organizations who have this holistic approach, who work with all these people and who can transmit their experience when it comes to curriculum and how to transmit this to the teachers, to the parents, to the students, etc. I think I'll stop there. As I told you, there's a lot to be tackling in these two presentations. And again, congratulations on the beautiful work. Thank you very much.
I think this is my...
Whoever wants to go first to address, there's a lot there that has been said. So please go ahead.
I can just start with, I think your first question was talking about the comparison of prejudice against Muslims in the US versus other minority groups. I will say that obviously I cannot speak for other groups and their experiences, but from my perception of what has occurred in the US, unfortunately, we live in a very racist country. And so there are each group, from my understanding, experiences racism in slightly different ways and prejudice in slightly different ways. I think, as you pointed out, with Muslims specifically, their identity is politicized more than any other group in the country. And their identity is directly associated. Any human being, any person in the US who identifies as Muslim is only Muslim to a lot of people in the United States. So, and that identity creates a lot of feelings of fear and them as the enemy, I think, more than a lot of other groups in the US. Whereas I think in Muslims, their prejudice has also been institutionalized, as has the Black community as well, but recently, so with the Muslim ban, et cetera. So this prejudice is becoming more obvious than it ever was before. And it's very apparent. No one is, I don't think many people, or if they are, that would surprise me, are surprised that Islamophobia exists in the United States, because it's all over media, and 9/11 is such a talked about topic and directly associated with prejudice and Islamophobia, whereas more than any other event in recent history, from my perspective.
I can go next. Thank you so much for your reflections. And I would like to discuss one of the questions you posed about teachers and how teachers may display phobia themselves. And this is something we didn't touch on in our presentation due to the time limit, but we believe that in addition to incorporating Islam into the mainstream education, efforts to countering Islamophobia should also be part of teachers' training. And for teachers to be able to reflect on their own biases, to reflect on biases within the curriculum, to create safe educational spaces for Muslim people and for all of their students, really. We should be able to provide them with the support, to strengthen their capacity to do so, and to provide them with practical practices to do so in the classroom. So that's something that is very important, that should be in addition to reflecting and incorporating Islam into the mainstream education. And with regards to your other question to my group about how to separate politics from religious, something we highlighted, we tried to highlight it in our presentation, is that we believe that the incorporation of Islam into the mainstream education shouldn't focus merely on religion. Islam is more than religion, it's a civilization and it's a culture. And this is why we believe that Islam and the contribution of Muslim individuals should be highlighted in diverse fields, such as science and literature. And also another important point is that while teaching Islam, we should also highlight that Muslims are also a diverse group of people. Not all Muslims live religious lifestyle, and that's something that is very important. So we do highlight that Muslims are a diverse group of people and the contribution of Muslims in diverse fields, not merely in religions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayelet. And in the interest of time, I am going to ask Firat to join us now and offer his reflections. And hopefully we'll have time for some of the questions that we have received. Firat?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you both panelists. Your presentations were fantastic, and for Renee as well, because she is the expert. So I would not be able to pose as relevant as questions that she posed, but still I will try my best to somehow address some of the themes and the questions that emerge in my mind throughout your presentation. And I especially liked today's presentation because they were research oriented and heavily in the material base. That was really mind opening for me. While I was listening, two themes and conceptual problems emerge during today's panels. And the first, I may call it a kind of how limits of classical American liberalism became especially obvious. Because in engaging with institutional racism and Islamophobia in our contemporary times, the figure of individual seems not really adequate. If we focus on individual, either a kind of just student or just person, like the hate speech performing person, it's not enough. We have to have a kind of larger perspective. And in this sense, focusing exclusively on students' perception is a kind of continuity of liberal ideology that individuals are primarily responsible for their inner world, and thus the agents and administrators of the political and social normativity. So if we intervene in a person's mindset, we can change the world. Though it has a kind of significant meaning, but still it's limited, because it would lead as a kind of the question of personalities, and educating children at the early stages would be enough. Unfortunately, the experience shows that this is far more complicated problem. So especially the critical social sciences have shown that the personalities and characters and individual acts are generally embedded in larger social contexts. Family is one of those contexts, of course. And any progressive politics trying to fight against racism and Islamophobia have to expand its scope to family or the exo and meso structures, and you managed to like the first two steps pretty well. And I will ask about some other possible second or third steps. And second theme emerged related to this, as I think it became especially obvious there is no isolated way to address the question of racism, injustice, and Islamophobia. Like only one part is not enough. a combined approach is necessary to convey the information that the ethnic groups as well as religious communities are complex entities with equally complex histories. They don't have one linear time, history, and genealogy that we can easily comprehend and understand what Islam is, what Christianity is, what Judaism is, and then manipulate it. It's much more embedded and part of social life that can't be abstracted away easily. So accordingly, I would like to ask two questions. One, of course, they are pretty much relevant to both groups, but I would like to stick with the first group, second group. The first group question is like, what are the possible exo and meso levels that a progressive policy may aim to make an intervention to? So can we think of NGOs as possible venues that the parents outside of school, parents may be engaged in a kind of critical reflection about Islam, racism, and Islamophobia, how the progressive policy can be flourish in non-school settings. Possibly, I'm not very sure about this, but like companies and industrial complex, a kind of company ethics, especially for the workers and the workers with kids. The second group question, what can we imagine for possible progressive curriculum attempts in the sense that rather than teaching people what Islam is in an isolated manner, how can we incorporate the question of complexity? And what I have in mind is like much more comparative complexities, like historical complexity of Islam, along with historical complexity of Christianity and Judaism. So it may require like maybe a philosophical discussion, literary education, and like kind of comparative studies. So historical studies, comparative ethnography, and maybe even philosophical discussions like San Augustus next to Ibn Khaldun and Avicenna, that kind of curriculum. What would be your like the projection about such progressive educational curriculums? Yeah, these are the basic two questions that I have.
I can take the first question. Thank you so much for those. I think one of the points that you brought up regarding the involvement of NGOs and stuff is really important. But I think one thing that something that we're talking about and acknowledging that I think what's really important is that this kind of curriculum and whether this content is kind of compulsory. You know, I think for people who really want to like address these biases and who are passionate about it are going to go out and will be more likely to go out and seek out those opportunities where maybe people who don't really understand the gravity of these biases might not really think of it. So those work settings are really important, but kind of as we were mentioning, they might have the interests of the workplace or of the company at the forefront rather than the interests of the community and the discriminated population. So I think one thing that we really wanted to emphasize is that this curriculum really should be compulsory and people really have to, not really having it be a choice that they participate, but more so that like it's just seeping in them, you know. But thank you for that.
Thanks, Lauren.
Sorry,
Max. I'm just going to take a moment to build on what Lauren said, because that's a really great question and an important one. When we're thinking about some of the social ecologies, we had a great discussion on focusing on all these other structures that connect to that too. So certainly there's NGOs, but also thinking about where else do the parents work in and how does that then influence the child, which includes, as Lauren said, the parents' workplace, perhaps community recreation centers. But even taking that a step further, such as hospitals or childcare centers or other areas where the child or the parent can be associated to. So considering that certainly there should be interventions at the school level in working with NGOs and so forth, but how do we now start to also create opportunities in these other systems, as you said, to also promote these interventions to come to light? And some of those might look like workplace lectures or something of that nature, but what we've seen in the literature is that the experiences individuals have with who they consider to be an other is what helps change mindsets and helps change values and beliefs. So certainly while there is this capacity to have lectures at the workplace or so forth, is there a better opportunity here to say, can we engage in community-based practices instead that bring these various groups together to then promote sorts of changes within mindsets? So again, at hospitals, at community centers, at the workplace, whatever it may be, recognizing that the child is going to be influenced by all these these system levels for sure.
I would like to affirm what the first two presenters just said and say that I think that also answers the question you had for us, but I'd like to expand on that as well. So when we think about, from an educational standpoint, Islamic representation and understanding in the classroom, I see it in a kind of binary, both voluntary and kind of mandatory exposure. And let me explain that. So when we talk about voluntary exposure, I think of classes students could volunteer to take. For example, in the United States, there's a course called AP European History, where students can take a more in-depth study of European history. And that kind of engages with the literature in Europe, the culture of Europe, and the history of Europe. And we would argue that voluntarily having an Islamic alternative to that, or in addition to that, could give that same kind of voluntary exposure where students kind of get the trifecta of what Muslim culture is in a way that's very easy to understand and presented in a class. Because as we understand, representation is critical to combating prejudice as a base level. So now, from a kind of mandatory standpoint, so where you might not elect to take a class, but still would need to have that Islamic exposure, we see just incorporating Islamic studies as units or parts of pre-existing classes. For example, world history or just studies of literature. While typically, and again, my own experience is US-centric, we have white European authors, we can add authors of Muslim and Islamic background. And into these courses that students have to take that are core classes, while it wouldn't be a new class or a kind of we wouldn't be reinventing the wheel, we'd simply be adding additional exposure to kind of give students more broader idea of what cultures are out there. And I think by adding Islam as one of the things you're going to learn about, it kind of takes it away from this political thing and simply makes it one more thing that is in our world that we learn about and we exist with. And that kind of equalizing and engaging in it, and just in the beauty of saying it's just a thing you're going to learn about, I think that really takes away the scary and unknown aspect that some people kind of engage with the students.
Thank you for those responses and amazing reflections from both of our discussants. And as I watch all the questions that come in, I do have to say to our audiences that I truly regret we won't be able to answer them here directly, but I did take screenshots and we will discuss them in our last class of the semester. But as we enter the last 5-6 minutes that we have of our time, I would like both groups to build on this discussion by addressing a question that was posed in a multitude of ways today from our audience, and that is that there is a broader recognition that we need to involve other modes and mechanisms outside of formal education, which is what all of you have already said. So one question, for instance, says raising awareness is crucial to shift perceptions in the long run. We had another question that reflected on importance of empathy and how do we build that not only in the classroom but outside of the classroom. And a comment that books cannot reach people like Facebook and Twitter does today. So should pedagogy engage with these platforms as tools, or will that cause more problems? What should we do? Partner with social media to make a difference or not? Either group.
I can try to take a stab at it. That's a really challenging question. I think so multifaceted, and it's really been in the news a lot lately. So it's definitely a buzz, you know. But I think there's a challenge, and what's hard is the lack of accountability with a lot of what people are posting, and even there's a lot of like invalid accounts that are posting stuff. So it's kind of how do you monitor that, and how do you ensure that the information is correct and sensitive to the experiences that people are having. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of value in having groups and people who are passionate and well-informed posting about the things that they're passionate about, but also kind of holding people accountable when they're posting things that they shouldn't be or things that are hurtful. So hopefully that answered some of your questions.
Yeah, I can just elaborate by saying I definitely agree. I think that social media right now is a very invaluable tool because it reaches audiences that other outlets just don't, whether it be education or traditional news outlets. Social media has the ability to reach ages and as well, multiple different ages that don't just watch the news or read newspapers, et cetera, to find their news and find their information. And also it has the ability to reach populations that may not encounter Muslims or may not encounter people of other races. So places in the US that are very singular and homogenous in their structure. So that's really valuable. But I think, as Lauren said, there is, if we were to use it properly and to disseminate knowledge that and people's lived experiences in a positive and productive way, I think that it would have to be a platform. I don't know if the platforms we currently have would be conducive to that kind of environment. I think it would have to be a platform that is more heavily monitored and evaluated for the information that's being produced in it, because I do think that this information, especially today and especially in our divided society as it exists right now, can be weaponized and can be used to create further fear and further Islamophobia in a country that can't seem to agree or produce a unified front in any respect.
Thank you, Lauren and Rachel. Just building on that a little bit here, I also think back to what you said, Renee, earlier about creating the capacity for individuals who subscribe to Islam to showcase and elevate their own sense of who they are. As in, I am a Muslim, but I'm also a surgeon. I am a Muslim, but I'm also an artist. And I think social media has this capacity to help shape narratives and stories that we might not otherwise be so familiar with. I'm thinking again with the Me Too movement, which gave the voice to so many women to say, I am strong and I am here and I'm okay with this. Or the hashtag I am a doctor too aspect, which is a little bit less known, but women of color who said, I look like this and I am a doctor. So it has the capacity to start to shift mindsets again of people who may not come to exposure with these sorts of considerations. So certainly there are so many critiques, as Rachel and Lauren said, and I completely agree with all of that. In parallel, there's also potentially this capacity to help shape narratives and stories that otherwise would go amiss.
Thank you for those insightful responses. And I would just add that as we close today, that many of us in academia, certainly I, am increasingly thinking about the ways in which, including this lecture series, ways in which we as academics can really connect to the real world, whether it's social media or other industries, and try to disseminate the messages that happen and the work that happens in the classrooms. And one question, for instance, noted that we need more videos, maybe 1 or 2 videos of likable individuals who can deliver messages that are promoting social cohesion and inclusion and counter marginalization of Muslims. And in fact, in the upcoming semester, I will be teaching a different course, social transformations course, but a course where we will partner with outside organizations to, in fact, create a digital initiative, social media initiative where students will, as part of their work in the classroom, produce perhaps some of those videos. So I just wanted to end in a way on a positive, constructive note for those of you who are concerned that there's not sufficient content out there, that some of us are working, including students that you have asked questions today, that you saw present today and on Friday. We are doing the best we can. And for any of you who are interested in partnering or doing this kind of work, you're always welcome to reach out to any of us. And with that, I again would like to really thank everyone for joining us today in terms of posing questions, but also our organizers who provided this amazing platform to my students and our discussants. And I do hope that we continue this kind of conversation. This is important and critical, and social cohesion is something that every society virtually in the world today is struggling, whether it is exclusion of Muslims or other marginalized groups. And I think a lot of those questions also have not been answered today. How do we make sure that by highlighting Islamophobia, we do not in a way marginalize other groups? And Those are complex issues and topics, as our discussants have acknowledged, and we will continue to work hard on them. And we really do appreciate all of you who joined us and supported us in this effort. And we look forward to continuing this kind of collaboration with Columbia Global Centers around the world in the future. So thank you, everybody, for a wonderful and constructive conversation today.